Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impacts these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. This is my second day back from maternity leave, my first podcast back, and I am thrilled to be speaking to adults. So let's get this started. Today, we have two brilliant minds from our research team here at New Frontier Data. First up, Senior Director of Industry Analytics. Please welcome back Ms. Kacey Morrissey.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking the time. And our next guest is our Chief Knowledge Officer. Please welcome back the fearless leader of the research team, Mr. John Kagia.
Delighted to be back and delighted to have you back, Heather. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's like just drinking through a fire hose once again, trying to catch up on everything. All right, well, we have a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. New York Times reported New York has legalized marijuana. Here's what to know. So New York has legalized recreational cannabis. Using cannabis is now legal. Selling it recreationally will be legal too once regulations are in place. So Kacey, I'm really happy to have you back. I know when I was out, you were on prior to this announcement talking about the New York market and had a lot of great insights. So I want to start with you. Why has this been so difficult for them to get it over the finish line? What's taken them so long?
Well, coronavirus pandemic didn't help. That pushed back a whole handful of states that were pushing for legislative measures to be passed in 2020. Our original list for states we thought might legalize was somewhere near 16 or 18 states. Only a couple, ended up going through. So that was a big part of the delay on the end. But one of the main things that pushes back a lot of these programs or timelines for legalization has to do with money, arguing over tax dollars. Where is this money going to be going? How is it going to be taxed? Who's going to benefit? It's always about the details. You can get majority support for the measure or for legalization, but it always comes down to the fine details. And New York was no exception.
Yeah, I saw in the article it mentioned that they were holding strong on a couple of things that was holding it up, but I think Cuomo was in need of some good press.
Yeah.
Right now with the scandals piling up on him, I think he needed some good press, and he was, happy to let the few things go. John, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I echo everything Kacey has just said. The pandemic certainly didn't help, but it was also interesting to watch the debate in New York evolve because, for example, you had arguably a more robust debate about issues like social equity and who would be able to get licenses happening in the state than you'd seen in many other, particularly Western states. And part of the reason why I think that debate was so animated in New York is if you look at how constrained or restrictive the medical market was in its licensing, only 10 companies issued licenses, 2 operations per license. It was a really, really tightly restricted market, which meant that, broadly speaking, only highly liquid entities with deep financial resources were able to participate in the medical market. So because of that, as advocates were looking at the potential, the prospect of adult use legalization, you saw a lot more kind of active engagement in trying to ensure that the adult use licensing would be more egalitarian and ensure that there's going to be kind of more broad-based opportunities for not just minorities and poor communities, but stakeholders across the state to be able to kind of be able to participate in this emerging market, particularly given the size that New York market is going to be.
I saw them mention that how the medicinal market will be able to enter the recreational market very easily. They've mentioned it somewhere in the market. What kind of impact do you think that's going to play? Just out of curiosity, because is that standard for medicinal markets and dispensaries to kind of transition into recreational?
Yeah, that's been the trend when a state is going to legalize adult use on top of medical in order to transition existing operators. They usually give a timeline lagway for those operators to enter the market first.
Well, it sounds like it'd be kind of like flipping a switch if you're just flipping over to recreational. They have all the infrastructure in place that would make it a lot easier.
Yeah, and so you'd think, but some of that does come down to the differences in the regulations between medical and adult use. They're definitely going to benefit from having operations in place, but sometimes, like I said, the details can get things tripped up.
It
Right,
is
John, were you
helpful
going to say?
though, to be able to have an existing medical market immediately transition or very quickly transition after the passage of the measure to start adult use sales, because what you're trying to do is reduce the amount of lag time between passage of the law and consumers being able to get legal access. So the longer you leave it between passage of the law and activating the market, the more time you give the unregulated market, the illicit market, an opportunity to get really entrenched. And so when your legal operators finally do get operational, they're now facing much more kind of stiff competition from an unregulated market that's had a head start to get acclimatized to this new environment of kind of post-legalization governance. So, part of the utility of being able to give the medical operators that first mover advantage or that early entrance advantage is it closes that lag time between passing the law and getting consumers into stores, and that helps constrain some of the activity in the illicit market.
Well, speaking of the illicit market, I mean, this law creates retail licenses as well as on-site consumption and delivery license. So how do you think that's going to play a part as far as competing with the illicit market?
I mean, I think that's going to be huge. I don't think that the legal regulated adult use market in New York would stand a chance without considering delivery alone, just given, how deeply entrenched the illicit market already is, especially in New York, and
especially in delivery,
especially in the boroughs, in the city, the delivery. So without having the delivery, that convenience, you really take a chunk of the market out that would stay on the illicit market if they didn't actually consider that. So I think that was a really good move, as well as the on-site consumption, which, given the type of tourism that New York City sees, that's going to be huge. And that's an issue that we've been watching develop across the industry for a few years now. There have been measures in certain states that have tried to pass on-site consumption, cannabis cafes, et cetera, but it hasn't really been able to take off in the way that that people really envisioned. So it'll be interesting to watch that space develop in New York for sure.
John, what's your take on that? I mean, the delivery seems to be one of the biggest things as far as just thinking about it. Because I know I think on the last podcast you guys discussed this. This is one of the things that was left out of the bill, correct? And now it was added back in?
Mm-hmm. So I think both of these elements are actually really important. Delivery for all of the points that Kacey has just made. The legal market really wouldn't compete, would really struggle to compete if consumers were relegated to having to go into brick and mortar locations. But I actually think the on-site consumption piece is also really interesting. For a few reasons. One, New York is arguably the first state to legalize and immediately make possible this kind of opportunity around on-site consumption. So in a way that we haven't seen in other states that are debating this, we are going to see on-site consumption potentially kind of come to its own at the same time as the legal market is being activated. So I think that portends a different sort of cultural evolution around cannabis than we've seen previously. Second, New York is the most densely populated and densely packed city that we have in the country. So the combination of a really dense human population per capita, coupled with relatively small living spaces, means that there are going to be landlords who make the decision that you can't consume in our properties. There's going to be some restrictions about where and when people can consume. And because of that, having kind of a third space, a place outside the home where people can gather and consume, I think is going to be really important for people who may be living in situations or circumstances where consumption at home is just not an option. And there's very few public spaces where you can consume outdoors, particularly in places like New York City. And then third, I mean, to Kacey's point, and I think this is going to be really interesting to watch, is just seeing how tourists interact with this idea of a cannabis cafe, a cannabis lounge, of the Amsterdamian model, but in New York City. Given all of the other aspects of New York that have made it an epicenter of art, culture, and cool, I think we're going to see some really innovative deployments of social use spaces, and that's certainly something to watch for this market as it gets active.
Yeah, I think the only cannabis space in New York City, just being a native New Yorker, it's just like Central Park after sunset. Uh, well, so sales aren't expected, like you said, there's a lag until at least 2020. What are you guys' predictions or projections for like once New York sales do begin? Kacey, I'll throw it to you. Yeah.
Sure. So once the market is active and we have sales, we think the first 4 years, it will take roughly 4 years for the market to reach what we call, a mature legal cannabis market with active participation. So we think that sales could reach roughly 3.2 billion by that 4th year.
Wow.
Right. So exactly. A lot of that will be fueled by the tourism.
That's awesome. John, are you seeing the same thing? I'm sure.
Yeah, and on this one, we absolutely lean very heavily on Kacey's modeling. I think she spent more time thinking about how these markets evolve than anyone in this space. So echoing that 3.2 billion, but it's part of the excitement, I think, about New York and why it seems to be generating more buzz than perhaps other states that have legalized is, yes, it's not just going to be such a huge revenue generator that those who are able to get licenses are likely to do very, very well. But it's a big state. It's a kind of very multicultural state. And so I think we are going to see just a lot of innovation around the way consumer products are developed, around the way consumer products are branded, around how deliveries businesses are structured, and as I mentioned earlier, and around how social spaces are created in a space-constrained city. So for all of those reasons, beyond just this very significant revenue opportunity that the state will create, we also expect it to be kind of a hotbed of innovation that will then cascade to the rest of the industry around the country.
Interesting. Well, moving on just to around the rest of the country, Marijuana Moment reported that 4 more states could still legalize marijuana this year after New Mexico, New York, and Virginia. So the 4 states noted here that are making some headway are Connecticut, Delaware, Minnesota, and Rhode Island. And if 2 more states get legal marijuana bills signed this session, 2021 would set a record for the highest number of new legalization laws enacted in a single year. So I do want to go back and take a look at Virginia. Virginia lawmakers recently approved the governor's amendment pushing the timeline for recreational legalization from 2024 to this summer. John, as a long-term Virginia resident, I really want to get your thoughts on this accelerated timetable for Virginia, and if you ever thought this was going to happen, then end this quickly.
Yeah, I'm blown away. I'm blown away. I mean, we've talked about this offline, 30 years as a Virginian, in a state where they used to throw the book at you, for them to go in a 12-month cycle to decriminalization where you've got a, $25, $50 fine for possession of up to an ounce. And then to less than 12 months later, not only pass legalization, but have this massive concession where the legislature was able to accelerate implementation of the law from 2024 to the summer of 2021. It is a phenomenal change and perhaps just an extraordinary example of what's happening within the rest of the country. Virginia is a purple state, and I think there's a lot about how quickly attitudes have shifted, how quickly conservative lawmakers have seen the possibilities here, and conceded that prohibition in its current form is no longer sustainable. Part of the debate in Virginia, part of what was fascinating about the debate in Virginia is that it wasn't really a debate anymore around whether legalization should happen or not. It was, how does this actually look in implementation? That's, the devil was in the details. And so it's a really important kind of signal of what's happening within the rest of the country in terms of, one, the extraordinary shift in public opinion just over the past 12 to 24 months. And you're seeing that now, that momentum being reflected in this cascade of states we see passing laws right now. 2, it's just another great example of what we've been speaking about in terms of, easy to legalize, hard to regulate, where you're seeing much less contentious fights around trying to get the law passed. and much more contentious fights happening around what the regulations actually look like, who can participate, when does a market activate, will records be expunged, will social use be acceptable, will delivery be acceptable. And so it's a pretty important sea change, but we would just caution, folks who are excited about the momentum that's building around laws passing, that just because the law is passed doesn't mean that the race is won. It's getting effective regulations to activate a robust market that have now become the next big challenge in the advancement and growth of this industry.
Well, what do you think accounts for this accelerated, like the just speeding this up so quickly? What are the reasons do you think has Virginia even just pushing this so quickly? I'm just very curious.
So I think a few things. One is demographics. I think we're starting to see the influence of younger voters in the political zeitgeist, in the political conversation. And so as you looked at the 2020 election returns, it was clear that younger voters really played an important role in the outcomes that we saw in the election. And given their extraordinary levels of support for legalization, over 80% of folks under the age of 35 now support legalization. If you're trying to court them as a demographic, being opposed to legalization becomes a really hard argument to make. Second, I actually think the COVID-19 pandemic has been clarifying. You've not only seen extraordinary levels of demand during the pandemic. On average, we're seeing about 30% increase in consumer spending post-pandemic relative to pre-pandemic. But I think you've also just seen a lot of people who've had a lot of time at home have seen a lot more cannabis kind of around them. People who may not necessarily have consumed that much pre-pandemic may have explored cannabis a little more during the pandemic, during home confinement, and during this period of phenomenal disruption to our recreational lives. So you start taking all of these pieces together, long-standing debate, the robust debate we're having as a country around policing and the implementation of justice and the role cannabis plays in that, the influence of younger voters, and the fact that COVID has sent cannabis consumer demand through the roof. And I think you have there the kindling for this storm that we're seeing sweeping the country.
Interesting. Kacey, what about the bill in New Mexico? Do you think legalization in New York had a significant factor for either state, like New Mexico, Virginia?
Well, I think New Mexico is a little bit of a different beast, being West Coast and being around so many other legal states. So, I mean, in general, the momentum of legalization tends to push forward, rise all tides. But I think that, even if New York hadn't legalized, I still see there being momentum in New Mexico. I still think that would have happened.
John, do you agree?
Completely. I actually think Arizona's passage may have had more of a role to play than New York's. Right. If you start looking at states in terms of kind of the neighborhood influence, where people are looking across the neighbor's yard and saying, why do they have it and we don't? New Mexico is increasingly kind of sitting in an island among states which had robust medical programs, but had not yet made the transition to adult use. So they've been having this debate for a while, and I think the state likely looked around coming out of the last election cycle and found that there was enough political support for this shift.
Nice, that makes sense. Well, before we go, I would love to hear, with these 4 states on the horizon, what is your predictions? And from both of you, and John, I can start with you. What's your prediction for 2021?
Well, I mean, I would almost argue that even if another state, one more state does not pass, we've already crossed the Rubicon. This has, in my opinion, been an epochal year for cannabis. And the reason we say that is, if you just look at the past 6 months since the November 2020 election, so adding New Mexico today, and we're recording this the day that New Mexico passed its law, we've seen 7 states now across the country effect these sweeping changes. And part of the reason why this is so important, these states represent every form of jurisdiction. The 7 states that have passed since November 2020 represent all manner of jurisdiction in the country. So you have very conservative from South Dakota and Arizona to more liberal like New York and New Jersey. 2, with the way in which this debate has happened, and the fact that you're seeing such little pushback from national political figures, you're seeing very little kind of discussion about this or you're seeing very little resistance in the discussion about this. It suggests that for a lot of the public, this is a settled issue, and the speed at which this is happening is striking. That I'm hearing, as we've been sharing some of these data with folks in the market, people saying, yeah, that makes sense, rather than hearing anymore, that's such a surprise that it has happened. So that level of acceptance, I think, is just part of the reason why 2021, to me, has already been a year for the ages for the cannabis industry. And candidly, if we pick up 4 more, then this industry is going to have a tailwind going to the next few years, unlike anything we've seen previously.
Kacey, what's your prediction?
I mean, I would echo all those thoughts from John. Just, this has been a blockbuster year for the industry, and just the evolution of the social perception of it in general. I will say, though, that I expect the dominoes to fall. I think New York, New Jersey, New Mexico. I mean, it's great that we're here, and it's wonderful, that we had a great year, but I still expect them to continue to topple over. I think the Northeast sort of breaking open with New York is going to put just an incredible amount of pressure on the Northeast states that have not only already legalized medical cannabis to further legalize adult use for tax benefits. They're already losing demand across states. It just puts this incredible amount of pressure on them to legalize. I see, a handful of states beginning to roll over with legal adult use over the next 2 years.
Yeah, without extending our session too long, I do want to ask, just because, John, we've had guests on here that we've gone back and forth of how, the states are legalizing, we're moving across the country, but the act of federally legalizing, I know a lot of small businesses are actually not on board with, because they probably get swallowed up. Do you think that we're getting closer to federal legalization, or do you think we're just going to continue to go state by state?
I think we're getting closer to federal reform. I don't know whether we're getting closer to federal legalization. So over the next probably 2 to 3 weeks, I think we're finally going to see what Chuck Schumer is proposing. And he made a comment a few days ago, Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, the leader of the Senate.
Our listeners are very smart, John. Don't worry. They know who he is.
We may have somebody from Timbuktu. So Chuck Schumer said that he is intending to propose or introduce his legislation for a national reform framework over the next couple of weeks. But he was very clear that he wasn't going to make a commitment when he was being interviewed on whether it was going to be decriminalization or legalization. He says he supports legalization, but the Biden administration seems more inclined to lean toward decriminalization. Obviously, each approach is going to have really consequential implications for this market moving forward. And given the way the dominoes are falling, to Kacey's point, there may be some utility in just going with decriminalization to allow the markets the states to go forward with their decisions, allow their markets to find their new equilibrium, and then based on a stable state-by-state market, come up with a federal regulatory framework that could govern that. The challenges with legalization is once that happens, then this becomes a federal marketplace with all of the regulatory oversight that will entail. And there's a lot of stakeholders who don't think this industry is ready for that. They want banking, they want tax reform as 2 critical pieces. But once you start talking about things like the FDA, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Justice having oversight over recreational markets, then I think that's a much more complex regulatory environment than we're currently in. And there may be utility in letting the market mature and stabilize a little before you bring in that level of robust federal governance. Kacey, what's your take on it?
Kacey, I'd love to hear your take on it.
No, yeah, I think that lag in between for those, however much time we have left before there is federal reform only gives a runway for existing operators, multi-state businesses, and like smaller businesses that are, just license holders in a single state, gives them a chance to actually mature and gain a foothold in the market, it gives them a little bit more of a chance if that runway is extended. And I agree with John that I think we're much more likely to see reform than full legalization. And I think it's going to be a little bit later than people were hoping for, with the change in administration. People were very optimistic initially, but I think we're looking at a little bit longer than we'd hoped before we see some reform federally. But it may not be the worst thing for some of these operators to have that timeline before the big boys come in.
Got it. Well, only time can tell. Well, thank you guys both for joining us at CannaWeek, and thank you to our listeners. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and hit the notifications so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. If you have not already, please sign up for our free weekly newsletter, newfrontierdata.com/newsletter sign up. You'll get all our new report releases, webinars, and podcasts. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I will see you next time.